Welcome to Face to Face. This is a show about change and about what's next. It's a show that wants to ask questions, peel back the layers of our average everyday experience, and go beyond scratching the surface. We interview amazing people with incredible ideas and stories who have done wild, weird, and wonderful things. Remember that imagination shared creates collaboration, and collaboration creates community, and community inspires social change. I'm David Peck, and this is Face to Face. Well, welcome to another edition of Face to Face. Today is, it's kind of irrelevant because you're probably going to be listening to this, folks, in about 6 weeks, but it's July the 7th. It's kind of ugly out. We had a horrible thunderstorm last night, and I'm sitting here with my guest today, Dave Toycen from World Vision. Thanks for joining us today, Dave.
Oh, I'm delighted to, David. I have so much regard for what you're doing around ideas and how to present them in really thoughtful ways. And
thank you.
It's an honor to be on your program.
Appreciate that. Thanks. So Dave Toycen, president, I almost said founder, president of World Vision for about 18 years. We were just casually chatting about in his 18th year since 1996. And today I'll let you tell us what you want to tell us about yourself. I know Dave and I have connected over the years on a philosophical level, and also on a film level. We both have a love for, academia and not Hollywood necessarily, but we definitely have a love for storytelling. Yeah. And I hope we get into that here today. So again, Dave, thanks for joining us. Let's start with an easy question. How would you, after this many years of working in the majority world, define poverty, or maybe even, and I want to talk about this a little bit, but or being at risk, or would you say that they're kind of the same thing?
I think they're really kind of the same thing. I think poverty, in many ways, it's about the lack of opportunity or the lack of choices. Maybe is another way to describe it. And the reason I use the word, it means that people don't have the option to choose to get an education, to pursue a job, to pursue there's blocks, whether it's everything from violence to cultural to just lack of opportunity. And so people tend to think of it as just a money issue, which is very significant.
Sure,
absolutely. Sure. But actually, I think what we've all learned to a certain extent, just giving people money doesn't solve poverty.
Right.
What solves poverty, and this is a really deep and powerful question.
Of course.
But certainly part of the solution is how do you change? How are you part of the change in the environment where the poor themselves still own it? In the end, we're not going to change it if they don't own the sense that they can be their solution.
Right.
We need to be there helping in whatever we can do, and that's part of how people get out of poverty. From a spiritual side of things, you can also look at it that way. There's a sense in which certainly the world is broken.
Right.
And we'll even find, you might say, wealthy people who are very poor.
Right. Well, this is what I'm trying to get at. Is I'm uncomfy now. The more I hear of people talking about poverty, it's usually, I was going to say always, sweeping generalization, but it's usually we're talking about economics at this point. Well, they need my help, and my help is a tax deductible check, right, or a tax deductible donation. And frankly, I'm a little tired of that. Or I'm suffering from a little bit of donor fatigue these days because there's too many people at my door, and so on and so forth. And I really want to try to get away from that personally, more and more to a richer, kind of more robust definition. And this idea of opportunity, I think, is interesting because, we all lack certain opportunities, right, on certain levels. And aren't we, and if we truly are all broken, then we're all at risk in one way or another, it seems to me.
Absolutely. We have it's kind of simplistic, but it kind of works. We have a saying at World Vision: no one's too poor to give, and no one's too rich to receive.
That's good.
So because I think more and more there's a kind of mutuality here. And so I think for so many people, this is certainly my experience early on in my first global exposure to poverty, is that you come away realizing that, yes, from a financial standpoint, these people are really poor, and their health is suffering as a result of that, or their kids aren't getting an education. But in terms of their care for each other, oftentimes their community, their sense of community seems stronger than where we were coming from.
Well,
that's very humbling.
Very humbling, and the cliche is kind of, oh, well, folks in Malawi or folks in Cambodia are far happier than we are, right? I don't know if that's always true, but we do tend to sort of focus on that. Folks that visit at-risk communities will say, well, they may not have a lot of money or they may not have clean water, but boy, they've got a rich family life. And
but I think you're absolutely right. We must never make that an excuse. As to, because I don't know, I've talked to an awful lot of parents in developing countries, and I've never met one of them that doesn't say, I want to be able to care for my child. Because their children are their future. So I think to in any way mitigate or diminish our desire to respond with things like mortality rates among kids, or nutrition, malnutrition, education, livelihood, and those still need to be addressed. They must be addressed, because the fact that they have a positive view of life is the way they've learned to cope with their circumstances as well. You look for hope. You're not looking for things to be worse. You're looking for hope.
Do you think that, and I've known you long enough to know that you don't like to lean towards the negative. You've got a positive outlook, and it's really quite incredible considering the issues that World Vision's dealing with on a day-to-day basis and the stuff that you've seen in your travels. But do you think Canadians, do you think the West, do you think those of us who are rich economically are looking for excuses to not give, to not get involved? You and I have probably talked about this whole idea. It's all about, if it's outside of my backyard, I'm not interested. So let's, metaphorically build a higher fence, and make sure I can't see my neighbors, because heaven forbid I should actually have to interact with them. So I don't know. I don't want to go all negative and cynical, but at the same time, it does seem like there is a backing away from action.
It's so difficult, I think, to generalize.
That's true,
Because obviously, in our experience, the special gift of doing this kind of work is you're exposed to so many people who want to help. They're generous.
That's very true.
That's true.
It's true.
But I've done enough reading, at least at an amateurish level, to have some knowledge of how generosity, how that's actually formed in people. And we know that one of the biggest factors is people who grew up in families, children who grew up in families where their parents were generous. That's one of the biggest factors. And so I think it's quite clear that not everybody's automatically generous. I do think it's pretty much a human response that when you see somebody in trouble, you want to help. I think that's pretty straightforward. And I think the money thing is a little bit more complicated. I think sometimes people are less willing to give money, but more willing to help directly. Which is a good thing. I'm not critical of that. But I think too, the other thing we have to be careful about is that we're not just talking about money, we're also talking about how people volunteer their time, etc. But unfortunately, some of the volunteering of time is actually diminishing, especially for younger people. Younger family, I would say. From at least these are more just my observations.
You know what's interesting? So poverty we look at, it's not just an economic distinction. And generosity, not just an economic distinction. Why don't we put a plug in for your book, Generosity, right now?
The Power of Generosity.
The Power of Generosity. You do need to get. It's an excellent read. It's been a while since I've read it, but it's still on the bookshelves. I think the thing for me that even just this initial conversation is doing for me is, again, it's a reminder at how, and this sounds like in a way an oversimplification as well, and almost a desire to disengage, but these are complex things.
Oh, absolutely.
Right? Absolutely. Very nuanced, very subtle. This isn't, like you say, just about airdropping money into a community somewhere in Papua New Guinea. This is way more systemic. If we're really going to have a long-term impact.
One example that just stands out for me, this was in Tanzania a number of years ago, and I was in a small community, and they actually had space set aside for people that were suffering from Hansen's disease, from leprosy. And we met this mother. Both her children, her in-law as well as her son, had died of AIDS. She was left with 2 granddaughters. She had leprosy herself, so she had Most of her toes were gone. She only had a thumb left on her hands. Her nose was shrunken. She was a very tiny woman. She would go to the market every market day and beg. That's how she provided. Her girls weren't going to school. I think they were 6 and 9, something like that.
Right.
And so we talked to her, and we explained how we were starting a community development project in the area, and that it was important that she and her granddaughters would be part of it. She lived in a shack. They really had almost nothing other than the goodwill and the beauty. She never.
Right.
She is interesting. She never stopped smiling with a smile on her face.
Right.
So we got ready to leave. She was a very religious person, and I had sensed that, so I try to be quite sensitive about these things, but I felt it was appropriate to offer a prayer. And so I did this, and through the translator sort of jumped on me because she said, "Oh no, you're not going to pray for us. I'm going to pray for you."
I'm going to pray for you. Yeah.
So here we
cool.
are, standing, my colleagues and I were standing there, and this little lady...
Christian woman, Muslim woman?
Yeah, she was a Christian woman.
Oh, okay.
She's just praying her heart out. She says, first of all, thank you for the Canadians who've come to help. Right? Give them safe travel back. Then she prayed for her granddaughters. And then she finished the prayer, and she never prayed for one thing for herself.
For herself. Yeah.
And we're all standing there, tears running down her cheeks.
Sure.
But that's just an example of where you go to places where you think that you're there to help, and that you're on kind of a sacred, noble task.
Right.
And you come away so humbled, you say, I don't know if I'm up to this.
Yeah.
This woman is so far ahead of me when it comes to being truly generous and thoughtful and spiritual that I'm just speechless, frankly.
This isn't just a 2-week short-term trip for this person. This is clearly a lifestyle. This is something that she's indwelling on a whole other level, or at least so it seems. Huh. And
it's also, I think, the other thing that is the preoccupation with hope in the midst of great despair.
Great title for something. The preoccupation with hope.
It's everywhere you look. Now, I grant you there are some situations, I would say, particularly with the AIDS crisis, I think, where you had people who were so depressed and connected with their illness, etc. That wasn't perhaps as much the case. But even there, I remember on so many occasions going into the little groups that formed of AIDS survivors. They talked about themselves as survivors. And even in those situations that were so hard, where they'd lost children or they'd lost their parents, and still hope was everywhere. And I just think it's, once again, the power of the human being to have hope. From as a religious person, I see that's the image of God in all of us, and that's why people are so valuable. It isn't just because we're a human being; it's also because we're actually the image of something even greater than ourselves.
So, this idea of others, it sounds to me like obviously a biblical notion. This idea of loving your neighbor. You got the golden rule in there, and so on. I mean, you look around the world, and I think historically, what do we got? 3,500 years of civilized history, a couple hundred years of peace. We've been killing each other for most of the time. Why is it so hard? It seems, so here we are telling these wonderful stories of hope and of this woman praying for you. I mean, wonderful story. And yet we've got, the Central African Republic going on right now. We've got tensions in Rwanda, it seems. We've got DRC and Syria. I mean, the refugee crisis is just... So is it a small group? Do you think, based on your travels, Dave, do you think you can say, listen, the majority of us are living a life that is at least acknowledging others? I was going to say through the eyes of others, but that might be a little too lofty.
Right.
Here we go from talking about get out of my backyard because I don't want to think about it, to maybe actually there's a brighter light here at the end of this tunnel. Maybe we just haven't tapped into something quite yet.
Yeah, I think there's always hope that there will be more and more ways in which people will see opportunities to be peaceful rather than killing each other. It seems sometimes that we just get drawn into this idea that it's an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. And I think it's Gandhi who said eventually everybody will be blind. Right. That's what's so crazy about all this. I I just think a lot of it, not to paint the picture too easily, I think, but I mean so much of it too is the circumstances. For example, you look at a lot of the killing, and oftentimes it's young men who don't have much hope, they haven't had much opportunity, or it's deep cultural pieces that are just, and every culture has a dark side to it. Some I think it appears to be even more violent, and so forth. So that's there, and religion drives it as well. I mean, as a person who's part of a Christian faith, who's part of a religion, that's extremely difficult to understand.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you kind of have to wonder too, on some levels, if it's really a misappropriation of religion, whatever religion it is you choose.
That's what we argue. You know, whether
it's a religious war.
Yeah.
It's just so easy to make
and
that.
So I mean, I wish there was an easy answer to that, but there isn't. I mean, the good news is that, in spite of what we really now have, it seems to be like a dark context at the moment. I mean, in terms of violence, where we've got 51 million refugees, the most since World War II, and the refugee is largely around violence. There's some climate refugees, or humanitarian disaster side of things, but most of it's around violence, and so it's just this. Just this thing that's in all of us somewhere, to be violent when we're threatened in some ways, and once again, poverty has something to do with it. There's political manipulation going on. I think one of the things that's so difficult is that when you see leaders in countries really just abusing their power, and they're just not accountable.
Right.
They're not accountable for that. And we still see elements of that in Western countries too. It's just, of course, most of the time we've been spared for the intensity of what we see, in places like Syria, for example, or South Sudan at the moment, which is another one that just breaks your heart, the newest country in the world, and they're back in civil war with each other. And there's a very tentative peace agreement at the moment, but I think it's far from over.
I think Jeffrey Sachs said in The End of Poverty, that he wrote maybe 10 years ago now, that one of the reasons why we, as in the West, should care about issues like extreme poverty and so on is because of terrorism. That was one of his answers way back when. Probably, I think it was post 9/11. You referred to a lot of these young men, in many cases, killing others with no hope and no opportunity. Do you think that's a solution? So in other words, if these young men presumably had access to these opportunities that you and I have, for instance, education, better jobs, and more comfortable lifestyles, et cetera, do you think there'd be a reduction in the violence? Do you think that
I think there would be, but I would be very quick to say we also know that many of the terrorists are very well educated.
Right.
And many of them have actually come from middle-class families.
It's good. It's
so
true.
It's not,
and very well funded.
Very well funded. Yeah. So once again, the depth of the brokenness of human beings is really profound. And so I think we still have to acknowledge that. But I mean, there's a side of me that says, why do we spend more money on education than on guns? I think of it particularly when you consider the number of women and girls who've never had an education.
Right.
I think educating women and girls is really critical, because I think when you look at societies generally, women, maybe perhaps because they're mothers, have had more impact on peace and less violence than men generally. I think, I don't know if I can say that's a fact, but that's certainly an observation.
Well, I definitely know it wouldn't take us too long to walk over to your PC there and find some stats from the World Bank and the CIA that would suggest that, if women are educated in a particular household, certain rates of disease go down, certain rates of inequity go down, certain rates of violence go down. So, they definitely are facts. So do you see that, it's a nice little segue, I think, because I did want to talk about gender disparity, and we've got this whole child and maternal health focus now, and development worldwide, really, certainly with the Canadian government, but worldwide as well. Do you think that's a key? I know Stephen Lewis also. Basically, whenever you hear Stephen speak, it's gender.
Yes.
It's gender disparity. Yes, of course, his thing is HIV/AIDS and so on, but he talks a lot about that.
Oh, absolutely. I don't think
And
there's any
empowerment.
question. Yeah. I mean, Rwanda, for example, and obviously there's been some controversy about Rwanda, but in terms of the advancements they've made in education and health and so forth, but part of it is that they have, I think, half of their government representation is women.
Right.
They've made it a part of, and I think that's part of some of the success that they've seen. And I think the presence of women in leadership, as well as being leaders in their family as well, is really critical for the future of our world. And so I just think the more opportunity that we can give girls and women to participate in their societies. Also, we're also dealing with issues around discrimination, particularly on education, but even the treatment of women and girls just generally. Here's a classic example. It's not just about money, because some of the I would argue some of the really questionable treatment of women is in some of very wealthy countries in the world.
Right.
So it's not just about money. It's culture, it's religion, and of course there's controversy around these things because once again you can't force people to change. It has to be of their own. They have to see the light. They have to see that there's a different way. And the good news is, I think, generally, is that when people do, quote, see the light, they actually do change. That's, I think, what continues to give us hope.
I want to come back to the women thing, but you just reminded me of a funny story. Over the weekend, I was at Home Depot and picking up some pieces for a friend's electrical job that I'm going to be helping him with. And so the guy who was helping me was in a bit of a mood, I guess. And he was complaining to me because I was listening. And older guy, I guess, who came out of the trade. And he actually used the phrase, "My faith in mankind has dropped since I started working here." And the reason, Dave, was it's very funny, actually. You could create a little sitcom around this. But this guy was so annoyed because he picked up a box that he was going to give me, and it had clearly been used. And so, they just don't teach our people at the desk to, when they look at things, they don't train them. He's getting angry because this was clearly somebody brought in a piece that had already been used and had ripped Home Depot off, basically. So he said, you wouldn't believe the stuff we get back here. And he goes on this big, human conditional rant.
Yes.
And I couldn't help but driving away kind of laughing about that, but also being kind of struck by that. I don't know how you would answer this question, but is that just, I really don't care about anybody else other than myself? Or is there some kind of connection there to our overall sort of global brokenness,
Well, I think so.
Just a part of being human.
Yeah,
I'm going to exploit you if I can, I'm going to take you to the cleaners if I can.
And I mean, I think that's where, as human beings, when we're feeling pretty good about ourselves, you usually can find things where that sort of behavior creeps in ways that you hadn't thought of. You're just less aware. I mean, terrible to have to make these kind of admissions, but I was on a flight the other day, and 2 new immigrants to Canada were sitting ahead of me in the emergency exit seats.
Right.
And it became clear to the flight attendant that they really couldn't understand the language well enough. So they got moved.
Sure, yeah.
They actually moved them up to a front row seat. But when they left them, they left a bag in front of them, and the 2 seats were empty. And as we got ready to leave, the bag was sort of sitting there, and Diane, my wife, said to me, "Maybe we should pick that bag up." And I says, No, I think they're going to come back. And I just thought, you idiot. You should have picked the darn bag up and give it. What was I thinking?
Yeah, right.
Just something
as simple as
that's
that.
what we're talking about here.
Yeah,
and that's
we are.
That's why I'm always amazed at people who think they're really good. I said, do you have any brain at all? Of all the little things we do that just show we're not as considerate as we think we are.
Yeah.
And I'm embarrassed about that because I'm a person who usually does the opposite. But my brain, we were coming back from holiday. I don't know what it was.
Yeah, sure.
But that's just an example of what just magnify that.
Yeah.
And if everybody does that consistently, we got a mess.
We've got
but
a
the
big
good
problem on
news
our
is
hands, yeah.
there's usually enough people, and I'm amazed. I have to say, as a new Canadian, I mean, I'm a Canadian citizen. I've been here 26 years. That's one of the things I'm proud of in being a Canadian, is that generally I find the consideration for people in Canada to be really, really quite good.
Well, and what I love about that is you are talking about the little things as well, Dave. I mean, here you are on a flight. You've got these new immigrants coming in, an opportunity to be generous and so on, and connect and so on. I mean, this is a tiny little thing, but you multiply that by, you know, hundreds, thousands of acts on a daily basis. What, you know, how can that actually generate goodness, the greater good? I mean, I know it sounds corny and idealistic, but I mean, I think there's a real power in
I'm a
in the
person.
simple thing. Right?
I believe in the smile.
Right.
I believe simply smiling at people is. Sometimes it feels almost rare when you get into a few situations. So I really believe in that. And I encourage people to smile. You don't know. You don't know what that person's been in.
It's true. My wife, Elizabeth, smiles way more than I do. I'm definitely more the more morose, melancholic soul in our family. And every now and then when I do it, I will actually, this is how bad it is for me. I'll smile at somebody else and actually think they'll think there's some sort of ulterior motive, right? Or I'm hitting on her, or what does he want from me? You know, this kind of stuff, and it's kind of tragic, actually, that it's sort of come to that. But there's talk lately, and I can't remember who it is, but somebody saying that we need to start going for macro change, big changes. Forget about these incremental things. Peck, I'm not interested in the little things, but. Would you agree with that? I mean, are we talking about the systemic macro kind of governmental stuff, or are we still down, or is it a bit of both?
I think it's a bit of both, because I think each kind of seasons the other a bit.
Right.
So I think it's both. I mean, for example, on the poverty reduction piece. The good news is we're down to what, about 700 million people, I think. Not that that's good news.
Right.
It used to be over 1 million. That we're living on $1 a day or less.
Right.
So we're moving that in the right direction. But I do agree that I think one of the most critical things is, if there's any way to help governments have strategies, frameworks within their country as to how they're going to deal with poverty, so that when organizations like World Vision, other organizations, UN, etc., there's actually a plan in place with a strategy. And obviously the other big issue is responsible leadership, so you don't have corruption and you've got rule of law. I mean, that's kind of the piece that you have to have. And so looking at that, and then put the economic piece in it as well, that's really important to keep looking at. Because I think some of the most difficult places to work in the world, even as a non-government organization, is when government doesn't function much at all. Because you just don't get the benefit of coherence, congruence, that the momentum that you develop when you've got a common strategy that's agreed upon. And the other part that's so important with the government's going to be there in some form or another, as far as we know, into the future.
Right.
An organization like World Vision, even to a certain extent the UN, any of the other helping agencies, we're only going to be there a certain amount of time. The people who are going to be there are the people and the government. And you might argue if they have a faith community, maybe the faith community is going to be there as well. So how do you leverage all that stuff? And that's the argument, I think, for looking at the macro piece. I use it in our World Vision work. We're a community development organization. For years and years and years, we're happy to just work in communities, work with the local people, build leadership. They carried on. But we started realizing, we did the analysis, that's good for that community. But it's like there's a glass ceiling ahead of it. If there's corrupt government,
if you don't have the infrastructure in place,
it won't be sustainable. And so that's why I think, but you've got to work at the bottom level as well, or the lower part of the level, because that's where the very tangible things can be done, and that you're in a sense practicing working together and bringing change. But I think it has to be connected
do you think
macroly as well.
Do you remember that 70s essay, and I can't remember the name of it right now, it's ridiculous, Peter Singer wrote about, it was back in the 70s, and it was kind of during the Ethiopian crisis, and he basically argued that if you see a child drowning, you're going to help them. Kind of what we talked about right out of the gate.
Absolutely.
Well, if that's true, folks, there's lots of people drowning on the other side of the world, so therefore, and it was an argument for child sponsorship, actually, this essay, and it's considered quite a classic in philosophical circles. Do you think, like Peter Singer, that we have a moral obligation to help at the macro level and at the grassroots level like that?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting. Somebody could cynically argue that the Good Samaritan story is kind of bad for the macro picture because it focuses so much on the individual. There's no indication that the guy that picked up the guy and took him, gave him care, that he went back and said, so what's causing this? It's the old almost cliche we use, the babies are floating down the river, you're saving them. At some point you say, why? Who's putting them in?
Yeah, what's the heck's
How do we get
going
at
on?
the?
Yeah.
So, but I mean, I don't think the Good Samaritan story is addressing that issue. All right, I think there are other places, and once again, now speaking as a Christian, in the Old Testament and the New Testament, where the macro stuff is addressed. But that particular story is very much about what I think is probably the primary thing we have as human beings. Is we see somebody in need, we want to help them.
Right.
But I don't see why we also don't then at the same time say, all right, but let's look at the big picture. Let's use the same helping spirit and say, okay, so how could we change the big picture so that this won't happen here?
Right.
So I don't really think you could separate them.
Well, what I love about that story is there's an immediate responsibility.
Absolutely.
Right. He was faced with this choice, basically, of, in this case, I guess one or the other. Really, it was up or down at this point, positive, negative, and that's what I've often said to people about. I've been accused of, when I give money away to somebody on the street, of actually, David, you're making it worse, and so on, and gotten into some arguments with folks over the years. But I've often tried to throw it back on myself and say, well, you know what? It's my responsibility to say yes or no, and I've chosen to say yes.
Yeah, that's right.
Because
that's right.
A, I hope and trust I'm helping, and B, it's also a reminder for me, right?
Yeah.
And there's more, and again, there's more going on than just this one transaction. I love the transformational versus transactional kind of approach to development. Do you think that governments are starting to understand this? I mean, I don't want to start picking holes in any government necessarily at this point, but this idea that it really is about transformational kind of approaches. It's about relational approaches. It's got to be about grassroots. You look at how CETA closed their doors here in Canada a few years ago, and now DFAT-D is changing things. And I just read a real critique of DFAT-D recently because we've added 5 more countries now. We now have 25 priority countries instead of 20, and so on. And of course, the critics say that it's really about business and it's not about human rights, etc. I don't know if any of that's true necessarily, but I'm wondering from your perspective if you think that there is a shift occurring at a higher level, not just in Canada, but globally, a shift occurring that says, you know what, we can make a difference. We can change things. And like you said, the good news is we are.
Yeah.
Now let's take it to the next level.
Yeah. No, I think that there is a shift. I think some of it has to do with just information. There's so much more information out there, whether you're talking social media, whether you're talking the investigation, the research that's there's just so much more information to work with.
Yeah,
so
sure. Yeah.
I also think the downside of that, though, can make people very impatient, because one of the things they're getting sound and video grabs of very complicated situations, and what they're seeing, of course, is the worst. And it's very difficult, back to the Good Samaritan parable again, it's very difficult to have a diet day after day of Syrian children being butchered, being killed by both sides in this war, and not becoming impatient and angry and almost cynical, I think.
Sure.
I think those are kind of the worst situations. There's no end in sight.
Yeah.
You got both sides entrenched, and it's the civilian, it's the children, it's the mothers who are just getting or suffering terrible violence from this. And so yes, I think we do know more. I think there's more demand, even from donors, to say, is my money really making a difference?
Yeah, sure.
So I think the good move for us on the NGO side certainly at World Vision, other organizations, is the fact that I think we were too activities-based before.
Yes.
In other words,
Yeah.
if we got kids in school, if we provided nutritional support when they needed it, fed malnourished children, we were satisfied with that, because at one level, that's understandable. You're being the Good Samaritan.
Yeah, sure.
But what it doesn't address is, it doesn't really talk about the impact. So in other words, kids are in school. Can they read? that might be a better, that's a better measure, what I think is called a lag measure, than saying, oh, we got them in school.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
Or, okay, we did emergency feeding. Well, at the age of 5, are they stunted? They survived.
Right.
But they've been so malnourished or undernourished that they're not going to reach their full intellectual potential, and they're not going to reach their full physical potential.
Right, right.
So asking questions like that, longer term, the community that we've worked in 5 years later, what's going on?
Yeah.
If it's fallen back in a heap, then we failed.
Yeah.
We failed.
Yeah, yeah. What I love about this too is, again, to me, it's an argument for the little things. It's an argument for incremental change. So yeah, the water might be clean, but if folks aren't washing their hands and still dying from other types of waterborne diseases, well, then the clean water is not going to do any good, is it?
Yeah.
And we're not going to really know.
And I think the other thing too, that we all have to be humble about this. I think our international president, we were talking about strategy, he said at some point you have to pick a path. Okay, we have to pick a path, but we have to be pretty humble about, can we attribute the success, if there is success in that program, to what we did, or was it something else?
Right.
This is the other thing that I think
great.
have to, we just have to be honest about that.
You were part of the solution. You weren't the solution, but part of a greater solution.
And of course, that's what drives research, because then research is asking the question, let's dig in and see if we can figure out what in fact, or where in fact we can attribute this. What did it? Was it because you did this, or because you did that? Or maybe because somebody, not even a part of this,
did it. Yeah, another causal factor.
Another causal factor.
What do you say to folks, to donors, to agencies, to whoever, CETA, USAID, whoever, who want to see these results in 1, 3, and 5 years? And I frankly think it's kind of laughable in a way, because we're talking about 15, 20, 25-year stuff. You know, the capacity that was built within my life at a kid, in some respects, I probably didn't really see the results from that. Well, it was incremental. Obviously, the results were over time, and then the one thing builds on the other. So how do you answer that?
Well, I just think governments, you can't overpromise. What you have to admit is, we're doing this much for this period of time. Here's what success looks like. This is what the finish line looks like. And so at least you've got to measure yourself against that. But we would certainly, I mean, from our World Vision experience, we go into a community and stay for at least 15 years.
Right.
And so we think that's one of the best things we're doing. Now, we're still, I think, would have to say, we've got lots of anecdotal stories of great success, but we're now much more rigorous about saying, let's get deeper on this and to be sure that we actually can show the attribution that's connected with this activity.
Right.
That we can say that.
Right.
So but I think you can't think this is going to be done quickly.
Yeah.
That's my experience. And yet I suppose the other thing I want to say is that there is a lot still to celebrate. I mean, when I started with World Vision 41 years ago. And the statistic we used then was we used, it's either 40 or 45,000 children dying every year from preventable illnesses. Okay? So now, 41 years later, there's a little bit of debate about the statistics, but somewhere in the neighborhood of 17 to 18,000 children are dying every year from these same kinds of things. So
that's every day, isn't it?
Yeah.
Every day.
Yeah, every day. Sorry, every day.
Yeah.
And so we've now gone more population growth, but still we've managed.
Right.
Yes, it's taken far too long. But we've managed to cut it in half.
Yeah.
And of course now our passion is
that's great.
How do we tackle this remainder?
How do we get the remainder?
And then the other, I'd say the more immediate thing that people can relate to is, I think in the 1990s, roughly over 12 million children were dying every year from these preventable, easy, but things that are preventable.
That's what makes me crazy.
Yeah, but I have to say, now, in 2012, our last measurements were down to 6.6 million.
Right.
So we're moving in the right direction.
We're moving in the right direction.
But the challenge now will be, the way these statistics work, the easier ones have been tackled.
Right.
Now we're getting down to the huge number of children. Something like, what, 40%, I think, of the children who die under the age of 5 die within the first month. So it's more medical.
Yeah.
It's more complicated.
Yeah, sure it is.
And then the other issue that I think is going to be really critical for us, so much of the remaining ones too are in context of violence.
Right.
And that's much harder to deal with.
Much more
Both on the humanitarian side, let alone the local people as well, how they can deal with it.
We got to wrap up shortly. I have 2 more questions for you. I have hundreds more questions for you, Dave. We could do this for the rest of the day, I'm sure, without catching a breath and maybe having a glass of water. Would you be doing this if you weren't a man of faith? If you weren't a Christian, would you be doing this kind of work?
Well, first of all, I can only speak of myself.
Right.
Because I know wonderful people who don't have any faith.
Yeah, sure.
That just doesn't appeal to them.
Yeah, of course.
Stephen Lewis is a great friend. There isn't any Canadian that I respect more than Stephen Lewis. He's a person who doesn't have faith that way.
Yes, yeah.
So, but all I can speak about is me.
Sure.
I guess it'd be hard for me to imagine that I could be doing this without my faith, just because of the way I'm wired, and it might look to a person of non-faith that I'm just a weak guy.
Right.
But I need a transformational, transcendent connection in my life, and I found the example, particularly of Jesus, both what he's done for me as a person, but then his example as well it's really enabled me to hang in there when there have been times where you're just so discouraged, and you're so shocked by what I think of the worst places. I think of what the Khmer Rouge did in Cambodia.
Sure.
I think of the years of Idi Amin in Uganda, visiting places like that. The Ethiopia famine was a whole other kind of thing, and then the genocide in Rwanda. All that stuff. It makes you question, or at least being embarrassed to be a human being.
It's not funny.
That's where my faith drives me.
Yeah.
And
I got to say, one of the things I love about Christianity is, the two greatest commandments: love God, and then love your neighbor as yourself. Number 2 is love your neighbor as yourself. Right. I don't know whether you believe in the God or not.
And the truth is,
pretty good.
It came second, but you can't separate it.
You can't separate
it. You actually can't. You cannot say I love God and not love your. Or you could, and from my perspective, loving your neighbor, at least for the Christian persons, that's an act of loving God as well. You can't separate the two.
Deeply connected. Yeah.
So I think that's the most powerful thing going for those of us that come out of a faith experience.
Last question. Clearly you talked about, what was that great phrase that you had about hope? I can't remember it.
Oh, the preoccupation.
Preoccupation with hope. And you are hopeful, and you are a positive guy, and World Vision's doing a lot of great things around the world. Are you hopeful about young people? I have a 6-year-old, I have an 8-year-old, and I am. And yet, there's lots of reasons not to be, I suppose, when you see what's on, TV, maybe the movies that are selling well, and now I'm sounding like already a nostalgic old fart, oh, Dad, But I look at my kids, and, they know where Ulaanbaatar is, and I'm so pleased about that, and they know about Cambodia. Yes, it's a very simple, understanding on some levels. But my son and his recycling and his desire to seemingly think about others. It's a small world that my wife and I and kids live in, but would you say that's is that kind of indicative of what's going on?
I'm encouraged.
Yeah. Please tell.
There's no question. This generation is more informed than ever, and there's some issues around that.
Yeah, sure there is.
But so many of them are motivated to make a difference. They're into issues around justice. It's clear, it seems to me, that many are growing in an environment where they're not going to be totally comfortable with their life,
It's good.
if these other things aren't addressed.
Right.
And I think that's important. Will they be perfect? Heavens no. They'll have all kinds of, they'll have dark things they got to deal with,
Yeah,
right?
sure.
I mean,
Yeah.
the downside of social media, for example, the bullying that's going on.
Right, right.
But the other thing that I think encourages me is that every generation has to find its way. Us older people, we can be there to offer some advice, perhaps, a bit of counsel, but we need to be pretty humble because this is their day. They have to figure it out. I also say that, once again, coming out of my Christian faith, I believe that too about Christianity. And I think it's true for any religion in the world. Every generation have to live out and make their faith real in their context. And nobody can do that for them. And once again, because I'm a hopeful person, and I also believe God created this world, created us, God's on our side, not against us, that I think He's created us in such a way that the next generation is going to be able to figure it out. And the next generation after that.
Very nice. Can I bring this back to a film reference?
Sure.
When you said this is their day, you know what I thought of? Because we both love movies, was The Goonies. This is our time. Do you remember that? It's
Yes.
such a great film. And I think it's at about the 30th anniversary, and it's just these kids who are going to say, the heck with the adults, they don't get it. We're going in. And it's just, yeah, it's wonderful. Dave, thanks so much for spending the time with me today. I know how busy you are here. And those of you who don't know who Dave Toycen is, president of World Vision, check them out. You've probably heard of them. And also, if you get a chance, pick up Dave's book, The Power of Generosity. It's a wonderful read. And anything else you can tell us about that's coming up for you in the near future?
No, we're just delighted that we've got such great opportunities we're particularly focused on mothers and children with this new commitment from the government, which is, I think, good news in many ways. And we're seeing those statistics drop as well. So that's good news. And I think the biggest challenge that we're going to have is just, I think, dealing with the context of violence.
The context of violence.
And the increasing number of natural disasters as well.
Right.
And it's getting harder because we have so many of them.
Yeah,
That's what makes it harder.
I got to say, you're wearing a nice bright blue shirt today. It's a great metaphor for your ideological take on the world.
Right.
The blue sky. I'm looking out at a gray sky here, Dave. We're about to get hit with a thunderstorm, and I'm thinking blue sky. So
we need blue water.
We
okay?
do. Thanks a lot for that. I appreciate your time today.
Great. Thanks.